Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining me today. We're going to be reading St. Peter and St. Paul together today. We're going to be reading some of the stories that Catherine Storr wants to retell to emphasize here their adventures here after Jesus has resurrected, what had happened after that. Well, we have pictures by Mark Pepe to help us illustrate also here what she wants to capture when it comes to these two disciples that God has chosen here and what they had encountered here with Jesus, what they had encountered here together. Now, these two are also remembered here as important characters that have done a lot to further God's kingdom here from the very start, as soon as Jesus had resurrected here, had ascended into heaven, and how we will always remember them here and all they have written in the Bible. Well, and everything that was captured about them. I cannot wait to get started to read this story in particular from this series that Catherine writes. And it's after a good number of stories she had already written. Now we're going to look into these two men's stories. Now let's take a look here. On the first page, it says here, after Jesus had been put to death, his disciples, they were very sad. Yes, they thought at first that they would never see him again. But on the third day after he had been killed, he rose from the dead. Mary Magdalene, who had loved him very much, you'll start to see her at the entrance. It says, saw him in the garden of the tomb where he had been buried. She told the disciples that he had spoken to her. They would not believe her until they had seen Jesus again for themselves. They were very excited. They were taking this all in, and they wanted to see if this was true. I'm sure they had checked that tomb afterwards. But what had happened was instead, it was one night Peter and John and some other disciples went to fish on the Sea of Galilee. They went fishing again after Jesus had left this earth. But didn't think that they were going to see him again. They weren't so sure what they needed to do next, but they decided to go back to what they were used to, but also ways and means here of being able to provide for themselves, or they're staying together here trying to take everything in. And it says here that they had caught nothing at that night. It was the next morning, very early the next morning, it says here, and this is what's taking place right now, they saw someone standing on the shore, but they did not know who it was. Who could it be? We have no idea. The person said, cast your net on the right side of the ship. The disciples did and found that they could not draw in the net because it was so heavy with fish. John said to the others, that is Jesus. When Peter heard John, he jumped into the sea and swam to the shore. Without even thinking about it, he has his clothes on actually as he jumps. The others followed in a little boat, dragging the net after them. So they were following behind, but Peter was so excited to be the one to just jump into the water and see Jesus. He was so excited here. Well, Jesus had now talked to them here at the shore. It said that he had made a fire on the shore. He said, come and dine. He gave them bread and fish to eat. Presently, he said to Peter, do you love me? Peter said, yes, Lord, you know I do. Jesus said, feed my lambs. Twice more, Jesus asked Peter, do you love me? Each time Peter said, yes, Lord, you know I do. Then Jesus said, follow me. Later, the day of Pentecost came. All of the disciples were in a room. The Spirit of God came to them. This is what happened after the breakfast on the shore here. And yes, Peter was there. It says here, after Pentecost, Peter and John and James went with other disciples many places teaching about Jesus. They had physically now started to travel, tell people about Jesus. You'll start to see here in this scene that they're helping those who are sick, who are weak, who have ailments. They healed a great many people. They and their followers shared everything they had, food, clothes, and money. No one was hungry or cold. They were all compiled their things here. It's a huge family helping each other. It says the people used to bring their ill friends to lie, or Peter's shadow might fall on them. They believed that it would be enough to make them well, because this Peter here is doing great work for the Lord that he knows, and even his shadow was powerful enough. Just being in the midst here of God's Spirit, right after Pentecost, healing can be made. Even in the shadow, just having that faith that the shadow would heal them. And so this is what's happening here. You know, all these things are happening, but not everybody was for him. It says here, and you'll start to see here, cruel men throwing stones at him, not caring about his well-being because they did not like his message, what he was saying, right? And what he was doing in the name of God, healing people. It says, Specifically, there was this guy named Stephen. One of the men who followed the disciples and believed in their teaching was a Greek called Stephen. The high priest and elders of the temple were angry that he preached about Jesus and healed people. Again, bringing up Jesus, they talked some people into saying that Stephen had been speaking against God here because they were religious folks that did not want people to go against God, but their way going about it was not godly at all, because they were using their defense for God to hurt people of God. And they knowingly did that, knowing the scriptures, knowing there was something up here that they shouldn't be going against, yet they wanted to, and they just wanted to be the leader, not God. And it says they took him outside the city and stoned him to death. Yes, that's exactly what's happening here. Now, Stephen was one of them. This is also going to be the first martyr, so you know that Peter and Paul would face the same thing here, or something similar, because they were preaching God's good news here of Jesus and his salvation. A young Jewish man called Saul, right, was still Saul at this time, meaning he wasn't Paul yet. He stood there watching Stephen die. He was pleased because he hated the Christians who followed the teachings of Jesus, because he was very religious in that religious mindset about God, which was not the true God and not the right way of doing it, because this was not the way of Jesus. Jesus was God. And so Jesus had come, and Jesus was trying to show the new way, but he was against that. So was the religious leaders. The men who were stoning Stephen had left Saul to look after their wow. So you'll start to see them right here, the Pharisees, and here is Saul. And so they had just left Saul to look after their clothes here as they were doing this wrong act. You'll start to see here. It was then when Saul continued to persecute the Christians. He set out for Damascus, meaning to bring Christians back to Jerusalem as prisoners. On the road to Damascus, suddenly a great light shone around him. He fell to the earth and heard a voice calling Saul, "Why do you persecute me?" That is exactly what's happening here. He's saying, "Why are you persecuting me?" as he's persecuting the Christians, which carry the Spirit of God here, that carry God's image, right? Carrying God's children. This is the people of God. Why do you persecute me as you persecute my children? Right? Saul trembled and said, "Who are you?" The voice said, "I am Jesus. Get up and go into the city." For 3 days, Saul was blind, that God gave him back his sight. And as we know here, it's because he was able to fully repent here and see that Jesus is God. What he was doing was wrong. He wanted to change his ways and make up for it. All right. In his position, it might have been tricky, but he was doing that. He was walking now fully for God. Now Saul believed that Jesus was the Son of God, and he went about preaching and teaching about him. He became known as Paul now. He has changed, transformed completely. The Jews were angry when they heard about Paul's, here's Paul right here, going down the basket here. You'll start to see that he is now the one being persecuted, right? And it says here, the Jews in particular were angry about Paul's preaching. The Jewish people, the people that were, the natives of the land here, the people more or less that also made up the Pharisees. These were actually the Jews here that were against God. They watched the gates of Damascus day by day, night by night, so that they could catch Paul, right, who is now Paul, not Saul anymore, and kill him when he came out. But the disciples let him down over a wall at night in a basket. They had to do this basket trick here, because that was the only way to keep him safe. And when Paul reached Jerusalem, he wanted to join the other Christians, but they were afraid of him until they heard how he had preached boldly about Jesus in Damascus, because they weren't so sure if this could be true, that he has changed, and went on their team here, went 180 here, and decided that he wanted to follow Jesus wholeheartedly and be a genuine follower. Soon after, Herod, the king of Judea, decided to kill Peter to please the Jews. And this is why Peter is now in prison, because he was going to be executed here to show that he was standing for what the Jewish people who were not following God wanted, right? He threw Peter into prison, guarded by 4 groups of soldiers. He meant to kill Peter after Passover, again, after the religious rituals, the religious celebrations at this time. They wanted to also like have, play in both worlds here, to follow the Jewish culture here, which really foreshadowed here Jesus' salvation here, which already taken place, that Peter is preaching about. And then after that, hurt a true follower of Jesus. Well, the night before Peter was to be killed, as he lay asleep, a great light shone in the prison.